in with prayer and explain then what we're doing both today and how it connects to next week as well.
Good.
So, yeah, if you would join me in prayer, you all. Yeah. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your steadfast love, Lord, and for the privilege that we have of being one with you, Lord, and for your presence and your guidance of each one of us in our lives, right here where we are. Thank you that you are continuing to, draw us and form us through our everyday lives more and more into the image of Christ. So for the opportunity, Lord, to gather with these brothers and sisters tonight. And I know, Lord, it's a lot of information to be absorbing, and taking in. So we just ask for the help of your Spirit, Lord, that you would give us, clarity of mind and heart, Lord, that we could, just be attentive to the things that you are pointing us to, the things that you want to draw our attention to. And I thank you for being part of a community, the community of First Pres, and part of the family of God and what you are doing here on earth now. Lord, help us with these, I know, very complex topics. Would you continue to help us to see the big picture and enough of the details, Lord, that we would understand at this time, what you want us to see and understand. We offer this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.
I want to ask that everybody mute themselves, please. I heard some stuff in the background. So Sally, Jackie, Sally, it's on the bottom, probably, or up. There you go. Okay, great.
Awesome, great. And so hopefully, if you weren't already aware, last week's outline was posted to the website. And so you can go there and download it now if you haven't already, or maybe you've printed it out, or just so that you know that it is available to you, as well as tonight's outline, which we're going to work through. That also is online right now. So you can download it now if you haven't already, or you can go back and access it later. I'm going to be displaying it all, and we'll be walking through it together. So don't worry if you don't have it in front of you, but I just wanted you to know that that's available. Tonight, well, I want to begin with a review briefly of what we looked at last time, just to summarize the big picture ideas. And tonight we're going to walk through a historical survey of how race was introduced and established into US society, bringing that more or less up to the present day. So today is going to be more information heavy, although it's all basically on that outline, and we're going to walk through it tonight. Next week, we're going to actually take time to process what we see tonight. So you might want to, strap on your seatbelt and shoulder belt, and take note of things that strike you, pique your interest. But know that probably most of our time is going to be taken up just with walking through the material, so that we have the big picture. And next week will be the time that we can really process things together, including I actually have a little homework for you. There's no coercion or rewards involved, so I can't make you. And I realize everyone is really busy. But there are a couple of articles as well that I've loaded on the website. I'll talk about it at the end, but which will help you. That I'm sharing them because they have so helped me to further bring this down to today, to our situation today. So we'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to let you know there are already various materials on the website, both last week's outline and then today's, and then reading for next week as well. Okay, so yeah, a real class. Okay, I want to begin by just reviewing the key ideas, the key takeaways the main points that we hit last week. I know that a lot has elapsed for all of us since last week. So let's see. Here. So can you see this?
Mhm.
Oh, good. Okay. So if it looks, hopefully it looks familiar to you. The thing to, the main thing that I wanted to do last week was to really update our understanding of race, and to understand that under this, if you, second sort of category here of race-related theories and concepts, corrections and refinements. This idea of racial realism, actually, it's the common sense, totally sort of universally understood and accepted understanding that there are actual human races, these groups that are like subspecies that really differ from each other in nature, all the way down to biological makeup. That's been the prevailing understanding for the last several centuries. But actually, we saw that genetics has totally disproven that idea. And so just to summarize some of the key statements from Adam Rutherford, the geneticist's book, he basically says, again, he says, none of the ways that we talk about race today stands up to the scrutiny that genetics has enabled. Families are too untidy, human history is too convoluted, people are too motile or mobile, basically, migration, you know, intermarriage, all of that kind of thing all over the globe. So he says the deck in terms of our DNA has been shuffled and reshuffled. Genetics has shown that people are different, and these differences cluster according to geography and culture, but never in a way that aligns with the traditional concepts of human races. So again, one way that he summarizes the findings is that he says, if we go back long enough in history, genetics will show us, he says, we're all inbred, which is another way, really, of showing that actually genetic findings actually are going to be consistent with the biblical description of the origins of humanity, that we all do descend from one common ancestor, from Adam and Eve. So the upshot of that is our deeply ingrained, and I know it's hard because these are habits of mind or whatever, but our deeply ingrained understanding that particularly that, you know, skin color and that kind of thing, that physical differences, that they are linked to real and deep differences, not only in biology, but in, you know, culture and possibly character, all that sort of thing, whatever. That's all been disproven by 20th century and 21st century genetics. And so, so the earlier race science is actually a pseudoscience. It's been totally disproven. Okay, that was the main point. And so if genetics and biology is not the best way to understand races, and remember I gave the descriptions or the examples last week, that actually it's geography and culture that accounts for the development of, yeah, bodily differences and all the rest. It's the migration of different groups and their settlement into different ecologies, all the rest, and their interaction with their environment and their diet and exposure to the sun and all of the elements of their environment, that over many years is what it's adaptation to our environment that accounts for our physical features, the differences and that kind of thing, as well as culture. So the picture that you and I were socialized into, that we learned in school or whatever, yeah, it's not accurate per se. So what is a better way to understand the differences, and what specifically race pertains to? I said what we looked at last time is that race is better understood as a social construct, but one that is not rooted in biology or in any sort of fixed or uniform differences within a racial group, and distinctiveness or differences between racial groups. Actually, race is a social construct. And so I mentioned that it's a sociological framework that helps us better understand where our notion of races actually came from. The last time we looked at the theory of the sociologist named Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. And I've just pointed out under points A, B, C, D, and E. These are different sort of phases, if you will, in the construction of what they call social reality. And then we saw the documentary, that part of that documentary, if you remember, with the teacher, third grade teacher, and the little kids. She ran this experiment. She said, and it all started, externalization was when the idea that she just had in her head, when she gave it expression and gave it language, and then began to attach consequences to it. That's when things went from externalization to becoming something objective and understandable and real to her students. So when she said, today, blue eyes are on top. I mean, blue eyes are smarter than brown eyes. And then she goes on that sort of thing. Just the very fact of her giving it language, naming it, and then beginning to attach consequences to it, right? Rewards to the blue-eyed kids and penalties to the brown-eyed kids. We could begin to see immediately, right? The brown kids were like, first they were resistant, like, no, and all that sort of thing. But she just kept hammering that home. And the blue-eyed kids, began to like totally accept that. And we could begin to see the brown-eyed kids, their faces fall, that kind of thing. Kids put their head down on their desk, they tried to resist for a while, but after a while, because the larger system, and especially the authority, was the one in charge and that kind of thing. We even saw one of the blue-eyed kids saying, oh, look, the yardstick is over there. Maybe you could keep it by your desk. So if any of the brown-eyed kids get out of trouble, get out of hand, you could use it on them. So that's what we were seeing is culture being produced right before our very eyes, right? And then we saw it had all these kinds of effects. And so that basically, so internalization, point C in this, internalization is when the kids actually, they absorb it, they assimilate it, they accept it, that kind of thing. They're no longer questioning it. The brown-eyed kids actually accepted and came to see themselves as being inferior, right? And that kind of thing. And they began to expect and predict that they wouldn't do as well on the quiz, right? And we saw how on the back-to-back days, the kids who were on top, they cut in half their academic performance, the time they needed to go through the test. And the kids who were on the bottom easily doubled, the time it took to go through the flashcards and that kind of thing. And this all happened, the teacher goes on to say, in a matter of 15 minutes, she says, in a matter of 15 minutes, they went from being sweet third graders, all best friends, that sort of thing. She said, in 15 minutes, she had created a microcosm of society. This is what we mean by the social construction of reality. And so just to complete some of the major process and some of the steps. Point D on this outline. So internalization is, again, when people accept the definitions, accept the meanings and the values that they're told. Institutionalization refers to when the idea and the value and the practices, when that becomes accepted and conventional, when that becomes the way we do things around here, things have become even more solidified, if you will, even more objective, even though it's all rooted in, this idea in the teacher's head. It has no actual basis in reality that blue eyes are better than brown eyes. And then the last step is, it's the last one that we'll look at, is what's called socialization. And socialization, for Berger and Luckman, that's the step where any newcomers to the system, any new arrivals, they too are, inculcated, they're, we could even say indoctrinated, they're brought into the system as well, so that they, under like point C, they themselves come to internalize the accepted understanding, worldview, way of life, that kind of thing. So race, I'm saying, is better understood as it's not objective, scientifically valid. They're not categories that are actually based in science and in genetics, that sort of thing. Rather, race is a matter of social construction. And so I'm just going to hit some of the main points here, some of the main statements here. I know this sounds like my description of the origins of racial realism. It sounds really like an extreme claim, and it sounds maybe really far-fetched. But actually what we're going to see tonight is we're going to see how actually historically the evidence for that statement. So basically 15th century European colonizers invented racial group concepts to facilitate their conquest and domination and exploitation of indigenous peoples and their lands. And I have a bibliography with the works of various historians and that kind of thing, if you want to follow up on that. But so I'm going to jump down here. From the outset, racial classification assigned individuals to hierarchically ranked groups to which the goods of the community were distributed differentially based on physical attributes, skin color. And then jumping down to the last sentence on there. Biological racial realism, which affirmed white superiority, the traditional view of the last couple of centuries. It reinforced majority opinion and leaders' efforts to implement additional race-based dominative and exclusionary social policies, which created the political, legal, socioeconomic, and other disparities that continue to structure and condition contemporary life. Tonight, we're going to see examples of that process. So racialization is a better word. It's a more accurate way to it's the way that sociologists in particular have developed a way to talk about the social construction of reality of a society based on race. So racialization describes a context in which race has been institutionalized. It's become the way we do things around here. And the result is that race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And let's just jump down to the last sentence in that paragraph there. A racialized society allocates differential economic, political, social, and even psychological rewards to groups along racial lines that are socially constructed. So tonight, again, I realize that might seem like a really big stretch, right? But tonight we're going to actually look at how that came to be established in society. So with that, I'm going to switch to tonight's handout, which you may or may not have in front of you, but we're going to walk through it now. And let me just pull it up. Let's see. Okay, where we are. Yes, this is it. Okay, so you have this in front of you, and hopefully, I'm trying to get rid of this. Okay, good. All right, can you all see it? Hopefully so. What I'm going to do is, because there's a lot of information here, I'm basically just going to read through the main points, and I may supplement at various points. But let me tell you about my objectives, I guess, and the focus on this. Again, I just want to preface things and actually let you know that, yeah, tonight's session, actually, what we're looking at, the material, may well be the hardest sort of not only intellectually, but emotionally to take in. I know it certainly has been for me as I've been working on these issues over the years, hard because we love our country. And I think probably especially first and foremost for its ideals, which we all know are fundamentally based in biblical values. We love our country and we love the freedoms and the rights and the privileges that we experience. So the reality of history, as we know, and as we as Christians ought especially to know from the Bible, from the way that the Bible itself recounts history and human nature and human actions, even of God's people and of the leaders of God's people from the Old Testament through the New Testament. We see both, bright and shining examples of grace and of virtue and of trust in God and walking in his ways. And then we also know, just both from reading the Old Testament narratives, but especially the Psalms, that they're constantly calling us to remember. And many of the Psalms, so much of the Bible is written not only to memorialize and celebrate the past and God's actions with his people, and to hold up various people and events, as a model for us. But then we know as well the reality that we're finite, fallible, frail, and fallen, as John Stott said. So I just wanted us to keep this in mind. And so the reason that I chose to focus on this topic, on this way of treating race, is because it's not ultimately key policy decisions that are enacted. That has greater power over the life of society than of individuals per se, of individual attitudes and that kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is to see objectively in history what created the conditions of racial inequality today. So that's what we're doing. And I also don't want to imply by this survey that this is all of American history. It isn't. We're being very selective here. We're trying to home in on and see actually what are concrete examples that first introduced and established a foundation, for racism in the sense of treating different groups unequally, the goods of society being allocated unequally. That's what we're looking at. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to be really clear about that. So the first event on our overview in 1492, as we all know, Columbus, his diary lists Indians as slaves among the many goods of the lands he claims for Spain. And actually, when I said that, it was actually all of this was really rooted in, believe it or not, in a papal declaration, a declaration of the popes in the 1400s. And so I'll just quote from a particular edict that Pope Nicholas V granted to the King of Portugal at that time. He said, "I grant you," quote, "free and full power to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate the Saracens, the Muslims, and the pagans, and other infidels and other enemies of Christ, and wherever established, the kingdoms and any other possessions, and to lead their persons into perpetual servitude. And I grant you power to apply and appropriate realms, possessions, and goods of this kind to you and your use and your successors, the kings of Portugal." I know that's a lot of verbiage there, but basically, the king, the Pope in this is in 1452. This is the first of a series of papal edicts where he granted, first of all, to the kings of Portugal free and full power to invade, conquer, subjugate all the peoples in every land that they went into, and to lead their persons into perpetual servitude, and to appropriate all the lands and goods of any area that they set foot upon. That's what the Pope granted to the kings. So actually, the roots of all this, the validation for this, the religious legitimation, justification for this, for all of this, for colonialism, is based in the declarations of the popes. Anyway, okay. So 1607, moving to U.S. History, or the colonies. The 120 colonists settle in Jamestown, Virginia. 38 survived the winter. The Powhatans rescue them from starvation. The next year, the settlers extract food by attacking tribal villages. Hostilities ensue. Governor Thomas Gates arrives with orders, which were brutally carried out, that the Indians should serve the colonists and pay them corn and animal skins. And then from 1618 to 23, the number of English colonists grew 10 times because they found tobacco to be a lucrative cash crop. So what I'm doing, I should have said this as well. What I'm doing here, I'm focusing on particular events that illustrate how the different groups related to each other. They're significant, pivotal groups. So I'm taking representative examples of different groups in American history as they enter American history and the system that's being developed on the ground. So this first incident tells us how things initially were, and then things going from going from bad to worse, basically, in the relationship of the colonists and the settlers to the Native Americans. And we see the greed, the profit, right, of the motive of profit and greed and settlement. They were determined to take the land. In 1619, the English first tried to, because tobacco growing is a really labor-intensive crop, apparently. And so they needed more hands, and they first tried to enslave the Native Americans, but that failed because they kept managing to escape and flee and that kind of thing. So the English abandoned that idea, and a Dutch slaving ship showed up in Jamestown in 1619, and 20 Africans were purchased from this ship as bond servants. And so again, most of the colonists, most of the settlers who came to the colonies, they were not free. They came as bond servants. You know, they had to indentured labor, basically. They were brought here, and then they had a term of labor, a contract that they had to work, usually 7 years, and that would pay off the cost of transportation and feeding and clothing them for the first 7 years. And after they fulfilled their bond, that term, then they would be legally entitled to be freed to be free men, and no longer in indentured labor. That was true of English and of all European, of most European colonists. There were more that came from Germany and elsewhere, but they were the poorest of the poor, Irish and others. Some of them were kidnapped, some of them were prison convicts, all that sort of thing. So so whites originally came as bond servants, and the first Africans who came were also purchased as bond servants, not as slaves per se. Okay, that's important. We'll see going on. In 1637, the New England Puritans, they believed that captives taken in a just war can be enslaved. So they shipped the Pequots, whom they defeat Pequot tribes to the West Indies, trading them for African slaves. It's not, it's kind of a head snapping thing. We don't think of the Puritans holding that belief. That belief is actually, in that practice, actually was very common in the ancient world and in the medieval world as well. That was standard practice, actually. What we see then is that in the next couple of decades, in the 1600s, laws in the colonies, they increasingly favor the rights of white servants, bondservants, over black bondservants. And they begin to pit free whites, free and poor landless whites against free and poor landless blacks as well. So some examples, and there are tons more, but I just picked out a few. In 1661, Virginia decrees lifelong labor for black servants. So in other words, even though the original terms were that both blacks and whites, bondservants, once they served their term, they would be legally free and that sort of thing. Virginia passes a law that says black servants must become lifelong laborers, i.e. slaves. And it was only blacks, only the black bondservants. In 1669, Virginia defines them as property. Let me move this here. And also denies them freedom of assembly and movement in 1880. So we have these colonial laws that are being progressively passed and building upon each other. In 1891, Virginia passes a law where free blacks lose their previous rights to testify in court and to vote. And to lose your right to testify in court means that any charges can be brought against you, and your word will not be accepted as valid. You're indefensible, basically. And then so we see this pattern where more and more laws are being passed at the local and at the colonial level, the equivalent of state level, basically beginning to make these distinctions between poor and originally bonded servants, whites and blacks, where whites are getting to be freed once they've filled out their terms. Blacks, no. And increasingly, there are more and more restrictions. And they're within a couple of decades, right? Between 1619, when that first slave ship arrived, and 1661, in what, 40 years, we have their whole status has been transformed, demoted from being bondservants to slaves, lifelong slavery. But we shouldn't, Virginia is important because obviously the first two of our three presidents come from Virginia. So Virginia is a particularly interesting case to look at in terms of the laws that get passed. There's a lot more, but we should also keep in mind that I point out that from 1700 to 1750, many Northern ministers are slave owners. For instance, Cotton Mather and Jonathan Edwards. The thing to keep in mind, it's so easy for many of us to, think of slavery as just as a phenomenon in the South and the economy and the life of the South. But no, it was ubiquitous. It was pervasive. And so, for instance, pretty much, enslaved Black people really built the foundations and the infrastructure of colonial society in all of its different dimensions. For instance, they built Wall Street. They built the Capitol buildings, and they basically the civic and the municipal buildings. They built that. They built the first universities, and actually, you may or may not be aware of it, but there's a real reckoning going on with institutions like Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton, Georgetown, Rutgers, all of these are first universities. They're all funded by, most of them are funded by large donations based on the slave trade, people who grew wealthy through slave trafficking, the transatlantic slave trade. It was through philanthropy, where fortunes were built on the slave trade, that actually funded Harvard, Yale, all of these other schools. And for instance, Yale, actually a number of the universities even had plantations attached to them. So Yale's first scholarships, the funds came from the plantation, the profits of plantation labor as well. That's true of Georgetown and all the rest. So that's just to say that there are a lot of gaps, I think, in all of our understanding of history and that kind of thing. But what's important to keep in mind is that the infrastructure, literally in all of these different domains in early colonial society, were literally built through uncompensated slave labor. And that was true in the North as well as in the South. And the North, slavery did not catch on in the same way, and many historians believe it's because of land, farming conditions, all that sort of thing, and climate. Nevertheless, Northern industrialists and merchants very much profited from and capitalized on the slave trade as well. Cotton mills in New England, for instance, there was a triangle trade between the South, northern factories, plantation labor in the South, and those products like cotton and sugar and those kinds of things, and down into the Caribbean as well. So it's not like, so the economy and the infrastructure of the colonial societies in the North were just as dependent on uncompensated lifelong Black slave labor as were the South, but not as maybe directly, but nevertheless, Northerners profited as well. Banking systems, all of that. So the next event that we're looking at is 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and we know what the beautiful sentiment from the preface of that: all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At this point, in 1776, enslaved Blacks were 1/5 of the entire population of the US. So in 1787 to 1789, the US Constitution is ratified, is only able to be ratified because of compromises that were reached that permitted slavery. The most notorious is called the 3/5 Compromise, where enslaved males were reckoned 3/5 of a man for taxation and representation. So there were very heated debates among the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But in the end, the only way that the colonies, they had been a confederation of states before this and throughout the Revolution, a confederation, but they wanted to, there was a movement to try to unify and to strengthen the nation, and not just be a more sort of loosely linked assortment of states. And so, but the only way, there were very heated and drawn out debates between abolitionists and slave owners and pro-slavery delegates. And the only way that they could actually come together and ratify a constitution was there were actually 3 different clauses that permitted slavery, which is certainly dramatic inconsistency, right, with the language of the Declaration of independence. We'll look more at this next week as well, but I just wanted to emphasize these points that are relevant to our look at how race and differential treatment on race what became embedded in US history. Okay, moving on. 1790, 1 year after the Constitution is adopted, the Naturalization Act restricts US citizenship to free white persons. So you had to be either a native-born free white person, or naturalization is possible, but only if you were a free, so not bonded labor, and you had to be white, and a white male, actually. So when we look at those three, the Naturalization Act and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence before it, you know, we're accustomed to thinking of the Declaration of Independence. It's what I would call race neutral language on the face of it, that kind of thing. The Declaration of Independence. The Constitution begins to specify and make distinctions between the status of whites and blacks. And then the Naturalization Act says that only free white persons can benefit and enjoy all of the protections and the benefits of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So think again about how are the goods and the privileges being distributed to people who are residents here in the US. That's the main thing that we're looking at and keeping track of. In 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. It made it a crime to shelter escapees or to interfere with their arrest. In 1808, Britain and the US abolished the transatlantic slave trade. However, that just means the slave trafficking stopped. Slavery on the ground, already the system up and running and operating on the ground, continues. In 1838, let's see, is that right? Britain, yeah, I can't pull it up right now. Britain actually then passed an abolition of slavery act in the 1830s. It was another several decades before the US did that. Okay, and then the next paragraph brings Native Americans back into the picture again. So we're looking at, we saw that actually that initially they were, we saw the initial treatment. And here, from the 1827 to the 1840s, we see this is a representative example, a really pivotal example though, of the status and the treatment of Native Americans. So, and I'm particularly focusing on the Cherokees as a representative of many other tribes. But so in 1827, gold is discovered in Cherokee tribal lands and a gold rush begins as word gets out. In 1829, the state of Georgia claims sovereignty over those coveted areas of the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes were 5 tribes, so-called civilized. They'd become largely Christian. They had adopted, not only did they adopt American ways of dress and living and that sort of thing, the Cherokees actually wrote their own constitution and modeled it after the US Constitution. They developed their own written language. They published their own newspaper, all that sort of thing. So Christianized and largely assimilated tribes. And from the beginning, actually, the Constitution specifies that the way that the federal government, the U.S., would relate directly to the tribes as independent and sovereign nations. However, the issue is, did states actually go with that, or did they do their own thing? It's what we're seeing here is the latter. So in 1829, the state of Georgia, once it finds out that there's gold in these lands, it claims to nullify the constitution of the Cherokees and claims sovereignty over them as a people and their lands. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act. There have been, actually, since Thomas Jefferson, there have been this whole vision, right, to displace, to relocate Native Americans from the Southeast because those lands would be profitable for farming and that sort of thing. President Andrew Jackson actually signs, an executive order, the Indian Removal Act, and it's not just a executive order; it's a congressional action. And the Cherokees brought a lawsuit to the Supreme Court. Actually, they brought 3 different lawsuits because the action of the state of Georgia totally violated the standing agreement with the federal government and that kind of thing. In 1832, the Supreme Court actually upheld Indian sovereignty and said that Georgia's action was illegal and invalid. However, so the Supreme Court weighed in on the side of the Cherokees, but President Jackson totally ignored that. He refused to observe it or to carry it out. Instead, he ordered federal census takers to come in and start, measuring the land and in order to be able to then parcel it out to white settlers. So in 1835, an unofficial chief of the Cherokee faction signs a treaty with the federal government, accepting payment for the lands and relocation. But it's a small faction, and it's an unofficial chief, not the traditional chief. So most of the Cherokees stay, and many are killed by armed settlers who show up claiming that the lands had been ceded by the Cherokees and paid for, that it was theirs because they got the title from the government. In 1838, 16,000 Cherokees are driven from their farms by federal troops and the Georgia militia, so state and federal, on a wintertime march to Indian lands west of the Mississippi. On this Trail of Tears, over 4,000, 25%, die of cold, disease, and starvation. And this next statement is from the State Department website. Actually, and that has tremendous historical resources. But basically, they summarize this period from the late 1820s to the 1840s this way. With the exception of a small number of Seminoles in Florida, by the 1840s, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, no American tribes resided in the American South. Through a combination of coerced treaties and the contravention of treaties and determination, the US government succeeded in paving the way for the westward expansion and the incorporation of new territories as part of the United States. And you can see from the footnote that comes from our State Department website. Okay, moving on. So this is just with the Cherokees alone. There were other similar kinds of actions taken with other Native American tribes. So basically, by the 1840s, the land is cleared and able to be distributed by the government to white settlers. In 1845, now we're shifting gears and we're looking at the Southwest in particular, the Southwest regions of the US. And that means our relationships with Mexico. In 1845, the US annexes Texas and declares war when Mexico rejects its offer of $25 million for California and New Mexico. In 1846, 30 armed settlers arrest General Vallejo They annexed California, and they declare that they have founded the Bear Flag Republic. In 1848, the Mexican-American War ends, and the settlement was that Mexico cedes the territory that now covers California, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. Cedes all of that for $15 million. So they should have gone with $25 million for California and New Mexico alone. But anyway, they receive payment of $15 million, and they lose with Texas half of its holdings. 100,000 Mexicans to hold on to their land and property are required to change citizenship, but without the deeds, without the land titles that US courts now require, many lose their property anyway, and they endure abuse and lynchings, and they become eventually outnumbered by the white settlers. In 1898, this is fast forwarding ahead, US troops invaded newly independent Puerto Rico, and that's how Puerto Rico became a US territory. In 1917, the Jones Act declared Puerto Ricans US citizens, but with no voting rights, and that continues today. So I included that because that's another piece of the overall picture or puzzle that we need to keep in mind as well. It's not just Black-white relationships, and or we need to keep in mind white and Native American relations, and then Latino relationships with Latinos, and how we acquired the Southwest, basically. The next, I'm looking at the Irish. So we have another example of immigration here. And this period of 1845 to 54 is important. 1 million Irish flee Ireland because there's a prolonged potato famine. When they get to the US, they find that they're despised and ripe for exploitation. And they unionize, they form these Irish unions, and they try to ally with Chinese workers who are brought in by factory owners as strike breakers, and then attack them, the Chinese workers, when they're unsuccessful. Pre-immigration, when they were still back in Ireland in 1841, 60,000 of them had signed a pro-abolition petition. They urged in this petition that their Irish American brothers and sisters show solidarity for the American slaves, Black slaves, and support abolition. But the historian Ronald Takaki writes this: earlier sympathy for slaves disappeared with the Atlantic crossing. In America, many became anti-Black, promoting their own whiteness and white supremacy. And this is a quotation from an newspaper editorial of the day. In a country of the whites, where we find it difficult to earn a subsistence, what right has the Negro either to preference or to equality or to admission? A powerful way to transform their own identity was to attack Blacks. So actually, many came to oppose Lincoln's policy of abolitionism. And you can see from the footnotes here, I've pointed to two particular sources, especially Noel Ignatyev's book, How the Irish Became White. That's a very eye-opening, and it's a classic study. So this brings to our attention, among other things, the reality that there are many European peoples who were not, quote unquote, Anglo-Saxons. They were Irish as well. But basically, the Irish were not a privileged class. They were not seen as white. They were despised by Americans here. And in fact, they actually, in Boston and in many other cities, they lived side by side with freed Blacks and others, that kind of thing. So what Takaki is bringing to our attention is they faced prejudice as well. And in the sort of, they came to see freed blacks as rivals and competitors in the market, that kind of thing. And so they had to find a way to promote the fact that they were white, to present the fact that they were white and that they were entitled, as that statement says. In a country of the whites, where we find it, it's a country, America is a country of the whites. That's what they're saying. And if we find it hard to earn a subsistence here, the Negro has no right, is not equal, should come after us. So you see the dynamic that's going on here. So there's really a complete reversal of the earlier sympathy and empathy and solidarity with the realities of their poverty and their oppression. From 1855 to 1920, 3 million more Irish immigrate to the US. And this is also really important. Oh, I could go on and on, but I'll just say this. Eventually the Irish were successful in promoting themselves as white and able to move up the ladder. And that's partly because the laws at that time prohibited, remember, only free whites can gain citizenship and the vote and everything. So as more and more Irish came to the US, they were able to become naturalized and to vote. And so that's how they gained not only a foothold in society, but began to move up and that sort of thing. Whereas non-whites, immigrants, were not able to do so, and not native-born African Americans either, as we see from the next point here on our survey. In 1857, the Supreme Court passes rules on the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. It rules that blacks are not citizens. They have no constitutional rights. The Chief Justice, Taney, explicitly wrote, the Negro has no rights which the court is bound to respect. And this is, this is what, 230 some years, almost 240 years after the first ship from Africa, the first 20 Africans arrived. In 1860, Charles Hodge, eminent Presbyterian theologian and churchman, he wrote a biblical defense, a defense of biblical and Southern slavery, in a whole book that was written to defend Southern slaveholding. I include that to show again how invested, basically, Christians, even eminent Christian theologians and church leaders were in this all. In 1862, the Homestead Act is passed by Congress. It's a federal policy that incentivizes and rewards whites' westward migration and settlement, fulfilling the nation's manifest destiny to spread from shore to shore, from sea to shining sea. So again, the lands have been largely cleared, right, of Native Americans. Native Americans have been placed in these reserved sort of lands, but much of the land is unsettled, is not settled. And as well, the formerly Mexican, the former Mexican citizens, Mexican nationals as well, have lost their land. And so there are various factors here, but there's a concern for economic development of the country, especially as the Civil War is in progress. So Congress passes the Homestead Act, and that's the basis for the pioneers in the settlement of the West. But again, who is receiving the resources of the land and all that goes with that? And this is a congressional order, federal government Okay, in 1863 to 1870, in 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's Declaration, which abolished slavery in the southern states, and nearly 4 million enslaved Blacks were freed, but not compensated for their labor. They were just simply dismissed or allowed to go, but it received no compensation to make a start in a new life. And then Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War concludes Reconstruction Amendments. There are 3. The first one, number 13, abolishes slavery. Amendment number 14 grants birthright citizenship, due process of law, and equal protection under the laws to all citizens. And then Amendment number 15 bars disfranchisement, grants the vote to all citizens, male citizens, on account of color, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So these are all, they're triumphs. They're all high points in our history. The thing is, backlash begins immediately, and in 1870 to 1871, Congress has to pass 3, they're called Ku Klux Klan Acts, because there is violent resistance in the South to all of these measures, to actually granting them. They're called Ku Klux Klan Acts, sometimes called Civil Rights Acts as well. But it's all, even though these laws are federally on the books, it's the law of the land nationally. At the state level, whether or not it's accepted and implemented is a whole nother ballgame. And so actually, starting in 1870, the year that the last of the Reconstruction Amendments is passed, the Jim Crow era of white Southern backlash, rolling back Black citizens' civil rights via state and local laws, backed by violent repression, begins. We'll come back to this. We'll talk more about the Reconstruction era, but you can see what's happening at the different levels of society, right? The federal, state, and local. And just because you have laws on the books doesn't mean that it's actually being carried out. Moving on, looking at the Chinese, where the Chinese entered the picture, 1870. In 1870, Congress passes the Naturalization Act, which bars Chinese from gaining naturalized citizenship. They're the first group to be excluded by law. And it also forbids the workers' wives to enter the country and join them, creating bachelor colonies. The Chinese were first recruited by business in 1848 as indentured laborers to come here to work in the gold mines and then to work on the transcontinental railroad. They're here, but they're the lowest of the low, and they're persecuted for their work ethic by other groups. There's a whole literature of there's basically demonization of Chinese. They're made to be scapegoats. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. So previously there were limits and restrictions, but certain people, certain businessmen, students, that kind of thing could still get visas. In 1882, you have a complete Exclusion Act, no more visas whatsoever for the Chinese. And so business turns to Mexico and Japan for cheap labor. The ban was in place for 61 years. It was lifted in 1943 because China was an ally in World War II. And the annual quota for all Chinese from around the world was 105 people. Okay. In 1893 to 98, this addresses, again, how did we acquire Hawaii? there were pro-annexation US and European businessmen, non-Hawaiian businessmen, and also Native elites. They conspired with the US minister, our chief diplomat. They broke the national treaty with the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii, which had been enforced for 70 years. And they conducted a Navy-backed coup d'etat. In the next year, the Queen immediately appeals. She's a Christian. Actually, the royal family had been Christians for decades. And she appeals to the president and the Congress. And there's back and forth. President Grover Cleveland was sympathetic, but the majority sentiment in Congress, it was all about annexation. Here's this opportunity for us to keep this land. And so there's back and forth and that kind of thing. Ultimately, she has to she abdicates to avoid further civil unrest and violence and that kind of thing. But under protest, she abdicates under protest. So in 1898, Hawaii becomes formally a U.S. territory. And then fast forwarding really quickly, in 1993, President Clinton signs a congressional act formally apologizing for the illegal overthrow of the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii, and acknowledges that it uses the language of conspiracy with the U.S. minister. So that's another piece of this picture. How did we become who we are today, and by what means? In 1896, moving on, Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court ruling that legalized racial segregation, separate but equal facilities, is not in any way contradictory to, and it doesn't infringe on the civil rights of Blacks to equal justice before the law and equal protection under the law. And then in the South, both at the at the local and the state level, there begin to be all of these measures to prohibit Blacks from actually voting. They institute poll taxes, requiring people to pay what they can't afford in order to register. So that blocks them. They put in place literacy tests, questions like, who is the county recorder of deeds? That sort of thing, those kinds of questions. And that's yet another widespread measure to prevent Blacks from registering and from voting. This is the era of Jim Crow we're picking up here, and things are coming to really a height in 1880, from 1889 to 1950. At this point in time, the Equal Justice Initiative has documented over 4,400 African Americans were lynched, including children and babies as well. And so we have, again, this backlash and this bound and determined resistance to allow Blacks to develop toward equality, particularly in Southern society. And so in the 1920s, in the 19 teens and the 1920s, we have what's called the Great Migration of many Southern Blacks to the north, and particularly to the urban north. It wasn't just a migration for the sake of economic opportunity and that sort of thing. They were fleeing racial terror, which was, again, the law and law enforcement was not on their side. And what happened under Reconstruction was that the federal government ultimately refused to, it wasn't committed to carrying out and actually implementing equality before the law for Blacks. So it didn't really allocate the funds, nor did it have any mechanisms in place to ensure enforcement. Okay, moving forward to 1924, Native Americans are declared to be U.S. citizens as well. Previously, they were members of their sovereign tribes, but not U.S. citizens. And in 1924, there's an act of Congress that makes them U.S. citizens as well. But maybe this is a very pivotal measure. The Immigration Act of 1924 sets quotas for immigration. And this is, it actually turns the clock back to the, I think it's the 1890 census, because there have been way too many non-Western Europeans coming in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So the Immigration Act sets, it reduces the numbers, the numbers of people who are going to be admitted. And here are the categories. 86.5% will be granted entry from Western Europe and Scandinavian countries. 86.5%. 11.2% from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. 2.3% from all other countries in the world. And Asians are completely barred. And so just so that you can see that for yourself, I'm gonna briefly screen share. Let's see if I can pull this up. So you can just see a graph that brings that home here. Okay, where are we? Okay, sorry. You know what? I'll send that. I'll have it posted to the website as well. I can show it on the internet, but I actually don't want to take the time right now. But notice how, again, who is being who is being favored here? Nearly 87% of those who are going to be admitted to the U.S. are only from Western Europe and Scandinavia. Southern Europeans, Greece, Italy, Eastern European countries, Poland, all of these other countries, only 11.2%. 2.3% from Africa, from the Middle East, and from other countries. Asians, not just the Chinese, but all Asian groups are completely barred there. That says a lot.
It's 8:15.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're moving. We're almost there. That says a lot about what's going on in US history at that time, but also there's what we call racial Darwinism, and these racial theories, again, of which races are superior and who is going to improve the gene pool, as it were, and that kind of thing. We don't want our country to decline, and so it's in our best interest to limit or restrict or keep out the races who are inferior and who are going to bring this country down, basically. In 1942, Franklin Roosevelt, orders the immediate relocation of 110,000 Japanese Americans to the internment camps. 2/3 of them are US-born citizens, so their constitutional rights were violated. The other third all had green cards, so there was no one in the US unlawfully. Note that there was no similar policy for German Americans and Italian Americans who were also part of the Axis powers in World War II. Many of the young men, the Japanese young men, while their families were held in these internment camps, many volunteered and served with valor in World War II. On release, after 3 to 4 years in these camps, families were given $20 plus bus fare to go wherever they wanted. What had happened with the order was for immediate relocation, and the Japanese Americans had been told, they were only told that they had at most 14 days to gather all of their, to settle all of their affairs and to prepare to relocate. So this is well documented historically. There were fire sales like no one's business. People lost, or they were either forced to sell their homes and properties and farms and businesses at pennies on the dollar, or they weren't able to sell in time. And so they just completely lost, for some of them, several generations worth of family farms and businesses and that sort of thing. Completely lost it all. They were not told where they were going to be sent or how long or anything like that. So after enduring 3 to 4 years in really abject conditions, they're released. They're given $20 and bus fare to go wherever they want in the US to relocate. In 1988, over 50 years later, President Reagan issues an apology, recognizing that their civil rights, their constitutional rights have been violated. This is after several congressional commissions and reports that came to these conclusions. And $20,000 reparations were given to the surviving internees, who now would be quite elderly, those who were still alive at that point. In 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling that overturns almost 70 years of school segregation, and it orders school integration. Actually, in the next several years, the Supreme Court had to issue continued additional injunctions urging that it be implemented. So again, the court has the power to make these rulings, but no power to enforce or to compliance, that kind of thing. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested and the Montgomery bus boycott began. In 1963, we had the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where both John Lewis, the young man, and then Martin Luther King and other leading figures demonstrated peaceably for this. And the fact that this is where the I Have a Dream speech was given, and the fact that it was peaceable and so compelling, that actually gave President Kennedy significant what's the word? Basically, that helped strengthen his hand in moving forward with civil rights. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It specifically barred segregated public facilities accommodations, and it barred employment discrimination. In 1965, we have at the beginning of the year, there was the march from Selma to Montgomery to address voting, to bring attention to voting in particular. And then in the summer, we have the Freedom Summer with Black voters braving violent retaliation and defying bans in order to register. And that's where we have college students from the North coming down to join the voter registration drives. At the end of 1965, the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which made the poll taxes and other measures by states illegal. So this is interesting, right? I mean, the right to vote was granted back before 1870, and it's decades later. It still was not actually, Blacks still were not able to vote because of state and local policies that were on the ground, and it wasn't being enforced. In 1968, we have Martin Luther King assassinated, and the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited segregation and redlining and all the rest in housing, it had been like dead on arrival in Congress for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it was only after King was assassinated that the Fair Housing Act was passed soon after. There's a lot more that we could say about that next week, we will. But again, just because you have congressional laws on the books doesn't mean that it is actually going to be implemented. In 1965, we have the National Origin Act, which phases out the 1924 Immigration Act with its white racial preference policy and quotas. The new criteria since 1965 have been desirable job skills and family reunification. And then one last example. In 1967, backing up, the backdrop to all this is that interracial marriage had been a prosecutable offense from the colonial era onward. For example, an 1880 California law forbade whites from marrying a, quote, Negro, mulatto, mixed race person, or Mongolian. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia, that the Supreme Court ruling ruled that anti-miscegenation, basically, those laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional. However, the laws remain on the books in 16 states, and the last two states to remove those statutes from the books in 1998, South Carolina repeals its ban, and in 2000, Alabama repeals its 1901 ban. Okay, so we've touched down on a number of not only historical events, but especially social policies that were decided upon and enacted on a larger scale, which created, I think should be fairly clear, created a hierarchy in US society in terms of the distribution of the resources of the community differentially to different groups based on race. The other thing that I'll say, and it relates to one of the essays that I'm asking you to read for next week. The other fact to keep in mind actually is that the 20th century laws that created our social safety net in the US, everything from the Social Security Act, everything from Social Security to the GI Bill and the labor protection laws, all of them were passed when racial segregation was still legal. So actually, when the Social Security law was passed, President Roosevelt made a compromise deal with the Southern Democrat senators and allowed the Social Security program to be administered by the states. Well, the Southern Democrats ruled domestic workers and farm workers ineligible to pay into the Social Security system. So they were shut out from the beginning. They were not allowed to put any money toward retirement and to have those savings accrue for retirement. So even though the language of the Social Security Act is race neutral, there is no reference to it whatsoever in the way it was actually administered, cut out, simply totally cut out large numbers, the vast majority of African Americans in the era of legal segregation. And the same, you'll read more about it in one of the articles that I'm asking you to read. This, actually, the GI Bill is the bill that historians and political scientists have demonstrated. The GI Bill literally created the American middle class between the 1940s and the 1950s. And again, Black veterans who were eligible for college education, for a low interest first home loan, for unemployment insurance, for a small business loan startup, they were eligible for it by their service in World War II. But most were not permitted to actually access that because it all happened still while segregation was legal. So they got left behind in the creation of the middle class in mid-century, in the mid-20th century. So these are some of the examples of social policies that, as they were actually carried out or not carried out, laws and policies at the federal, state, and local level, they explain in large part why, in particular, I would say African Americans and Native Americans have been shut out and unable to catch up. That's a really, I know we just did a really fast walk through all of that, and there's a lot of sobering information, probably a lot of new information, which is why I wanted, why next week we're going to set aside time to just discuss and process this. I have, like I said, yeah, there's material on the website that I'm asking you to read, if at all possible, several of them, because that will help to fill in some of the gaps more and connect the dots to conditions today. But just as we close for now, I just want to draw our attention to two definitions of racism that come from a historian, from George Fredrickson, a professor at Princeton. And we'll go to the second. Well, we'll just read the first couple lines here. He says, when groups whose differing ancestry is culturally or physically marked, when they come into adversarial contact, there's a powerful temptation, especially on the part of the more powerful group, to justify aggression, domination, or extermination by invoking differences defined as racial, meaning they're intrinsic and unchangeable. And then he also says, his own theory or concept of racism has two components, difference and power. It originates from a mindset that regards them as different from us in ways that are permanent and unbridgeable. This sense of difference provides a motive or rationale for using our power advantage to treat the ethno-racial others in ways that we would regard as cruel or unjust if applied to members of our own group. So race and racism, it's a nexus, it's an interconnected thing of attitude and action. And that's why racialization, to come back to that definition that we looked at last week and reviewed today, that's why Emerson and Smith's definitions are so helpful here. Due to the origins of the idea of race, the placement of people in racial groups always means some form of hierarchy. That is why we may define a racialized society in part as one that allocates differential rewards by race along lines that are socially constructed. It allocates differential economic, political, social, and even psychological rewards to groups along racial lines that are socially constructed. So next week, we're gonna discuss and process these things more and talk about the fact that it doesn't require racism. need to consider it at the personal level of, you know, attitudes and beliefs and that kind of thing that we require. But there's also structural racism or institutionalized racism, which doesn't necessarily mean that we believe that races exist, or we may not intend to neglect or harm racial others. But the way that the system is already up and running, already automatically favors certain groups and disfavors and disadvantages others. Okay, so for next week, and this is all on the website, I've highlighted a couple of articles that if you have time at all, they're short, they're about maybe 2 or 3 pages each, but they will help to, the ones that I bolded there would be the most crucial ones. They will help to fill in the gaps and connect, help us connect history with what's going on today. I'm also going to post on the website this bibliography of books, which are some of the main sources of information that my analysis is drawn from. And if you want to go further, so, and in particular, tonight's sort of lecture, it is based, these are sort of beginning books that I would recommend in different areas if you're going to read that. If you want to read further, you know, after the course is over, that kind of thing. Okay, yeah, so sorry, we've gone 2 minutes over. I'm gonna stop the share and come back. So I know that was a lot of information. Just know that, again, I live with a heavy heart working on these issues, and I've lived with a heavy heart actually now for a couple of decades working on these issues and researching on that. And so I'm aware that a lot of what we looked at is probably like new information and disturbing, rightly so. And again, this doesn't represent by any means all of American history, but what we're trying to do is to keep our eye on the ball and to focus particularly on what has created the conditions of racial inequality today. That's how I'm focusing on the issue of racism per se. So we're going to, next week, we're going to diagnose and discuss, and I'm going to introduce some more concepts, some more conceptual distinctions, which will help us to differentiate different forms in which racism appears and racialization of society as well. Okay? Thanks for hanging in there for a really content heavy presentation. Nancy, do you have any thoughts? Do you want to close this?
Lisa, not all of these essays are on the website. So if you would check it when you get a chance, and
I will.
Send whatever to Julia that we need, that would be great.
I will. I'll do that tomorrow morning. Yes, I added a few since we last talked.
So if there's nothing more, I'll be happy to close us in prayer if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Okay,
Lord Jesus, thank you that you are loving and you are no respecter of persons. We just confess our own, sometimes totally unwitting judgment of other people based on society or on things we didn't really realize we're doing. I thank you, Lord, for this chance to see people in your viewpoint and show us each how to love you more and love each other. Bless Lisa, and I thank you for all that you've taught her, that she's trying to let us understand as well. Help us as we read, and bless everyone this week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.